But you say, wait a minute, at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, they have a memorial banner of 4,000 names of children. But actually, if you take a closer look and you do a bit of research, you find out that this list of names includes names of a young adult murder victim, nothing to do with Indian residential schools, an 85-year-old, a person who died of a gunshot wound, someone who died of a train accident. None of those have anything to do with Indian residential schools. And it seems like what has happened is as this memorial banner has become, shall we say, it's not nice to say contaminated, because it's not memorializing only children who died at Indian residential schools. People have wanted to remember their loved ones. So they put their name forth and it went on the banner. So we have all kinds of people's names there who had nothing to do with residential schools, but it looks like, wow, thousands of children died there. These are not all the names of people who died at residential schools. The theme is how UNDRIP, that's UN, Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People, jumped the shark on the graves of innocents. Okay, here we go. So Tucker Carlson was here in the spring, and he pointed out something really important. If you're on the side of burning churches, you're on the wrong side. And there's been a radical change in Canada. Many people are perplexed at what appear to be radical changes in Canada over the past few years. And when Tucker Carlson noted that, there's something wrong in a country when churches and sacred sites of peace-loving Christians are burned to the ground or vandalized with little outcry from the public and little apparent follow-up and charges by police, and statements that such violence is understandable from the government. So what's happened is mass graves and the UNDRIP, the balkanization of Canada. Canada is being torn apart, and the truth is going up in flames as well. On May 27th, 2021, this bombshell hit social media, and it was from CFJC Today in Kamloops, announcing that Kamloops, that means the Kamloops First Nation, confirms bodies of 215 children buried at former Kamloops Indian residential school site. And all of a sudden, boom, Canada went from being a peacekeeper to a genocidal global pariah. And there were headlines around the world. The Guardian in the UK, Canada, remains of 215 children found at Indigenous residential school site. The New York Times, horrible history, mass grave. Toronto Star, discovery of Indigenous children's bodies, reminder of Canada's genocide. And look at this, remains, mass grave, bodies, genocide. Now, you'd think they'd have some proof of this. And even experts are saying that this is true, but Canada has never been accused or convicted of genocide in any court of law. Now, people don't know this, but the federal government was informed of the find and did no due diligence. So there is on record, I believe it's Mark Miller, who tells the House that he'd received a call from the Kamloops band the night before their announcement. And you have to wonder, why didn't the government then say, you know what, if you make this announcement, we will not confirm it until we have actual evidence? Or why didn't they say, maybe you should wait until some of these sites are excavated, because this is a pretty jarring claim. But they accepted the Kamloops band's claim without question. So you have to ask yourself, why? So that's not the only thing that happened. About a year and a half later, we were deemed guilty of genocide by a unanimous vote in the House of Commons. I don't know how many listeners might have heard of that. When I presented this at Freedom Talk, almost no one in the audience knew that. So the House of Commons recognized Canada's Indian residential school system as an act of genocide. It was a unanimous vote. It was put forward by NDP MP Leah Gazan. So, and And she said, "Today I lift up survivors, families, and communities who have sacrificed so much in order for people across Canada to know the truth that what happened in residential schools was genocide. I'm grateful to parliamentarians who unanimously passed my motion recognizing the truth of Canadian history." And then a year later, in the same House of Commons, Harrison Faulkner notes here that MPs stand for a moment of silence to mark the discovery of the remains of 215 children at a former residential school in Kamloops. But no remains have been discovered. So that's pretty weird. A moment of silence for a phantom genocide. So what constitutes genocide? Well, this is from the Geneva Convention. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So, was there an intent to destroy Native people on the part of the Canadian government? And were children forcibly transferred from one group to another? Forcibly transferred is one of the key points that is often stated about Indian residential schools, that children were torn from the arms of their mothers. But in fact, the Kamloops Indian Band requested a residential school, and this is from a historical document. And they even granted land on various reserves for residential schools, because these people saw that the future was going to be very different from the past, and they wanted their children to have an opportunity to succeed. They knew they needed education. Now, contrary to what you've been told 1,000 times in the media, parents actually enrolled their children, and rather than the claim that children were evangelized and forced to accept Christianity at these schools, the children were sent to a school that aligned with the family's existing Christian Catholic denomination. And you can see here on this admission form that this person, Betsy Osborne of Cress Lake, is being admitted to a Roman Catholic school because her family is Roman Catholic. And you can also see something that's very important to note on the other item over on this side here. All the particulars must be given: the name of the band, number of the ticket under which the child's annuity is paid, and the religion. Now, what's very important is the minimum age for admission is 7 years, except in the case of an orphan, a destitute, or neglected child, because Indian residential schools acted as the social welfare function before a social welfare system was set up. So social welfare began being set up in the 60s, and the schools stopped operating within about a decade and a half after that. But up until that time, they took in every kind of case of orphans, destitute children, neglected children, children at risk of domestic violence. And that's never talked about, that those children's lives were saved by these schools. And so how is that genocide? How is any of that genocide? Well, when truth and reconciliation begins with lies, guess what you get? Now, this sign is from a kiosk which was at the entryway to the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Canadians spent $60 million over a 5-year period on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There were 3 commissioners: Chief Wilton Littlechild, Murray Sinclair, a former judge and senator, and Marie Wilson, the wife of Stephen Kakfe, who is a prominent Dene politician and Indigenous activist and author. She was the only non-Indigenous person on the commission. So they traveled across the country and they heard from former students. But as you entered this hearing, if you like, it said school days. Students living at the residential schools faced experiences which, for most, ranged from degradation to abuse and death. 150,000 children went through the Indian residential school system over the course of 113 years. Most of those students are still alive, with the exception of those who would have been in the earliest era and would have passed away from natural causes and old age. So, to say that for most ranged from degradation to abuse and death makes it sound like of the 150,000, only 25,000 remain, which is not the truth. So it also says their parents left behind in communities devoid of children suffered as well. Well, only 1/3 of all eligible children ever went to Indian residential schools. And furthermore, after the earliest years of the Indian residential schools, most reserves also had what was called an Indian day school set up on their reserve. So if you had an Indian day school on your reserve, your children could go there if you wanted. But many people preferred to send their children to Indian residential school because, just like today with daycare, if you were a hunter-trapper family and you wanted to go out in your trap line, it would be far easier to have your children learning at a residential school so that you could go off and work and earn a living, rather than trying to deal with all your children in tow while you're out in the woods hunting or trapping. So the communities were not devoid of children. And then it says in 1920, it became a crime punishable by imprisonment to refuse to send an Aboriginal child to a residential school. In 1920, this is federal legislation for residential schools. So in 1920, they aligned the federal legislation for Indian residential schools with provincial truancy laws. And if your child today is registered in a public school in Canada and does not show up for class without proper excuses and communication with the family, with the mom calling in saying, my son is sick, he's staying home today, or someone saying, oh, I'm sorry, there was a funeral, there was a tragedy in the family, we have to go to a funeral in Ontario, we'll be away for 2 weeks. If there's no proper excuse, you better believe that the police will show up with a social worker and find out what's going on, because there are truancy laws to this day. It also says in 1933, principals were granted guardianship of the children. Well, this is exactly like today at any school where you send your child to the school accepts what's called in loco parentis, meaning in place of the parent, meaning that they have the authority to say, okay, we're going to class now and you're going to class with me. They have the authority to give appropriate commands to the children, because they're acting in place of the parent. So that there are many instances where parents decided they didn't want their child in the school anymore, or they had complaints about food or discipline, or circumstances in the family changed, and they were quite able to come and say, I want to take my child out of the school. The only technicality was that, of course, the annuity that was paid to the school when the child was there would then be transferred back to the band, that the child would go back under the band treaty rules, and the family would be accordingly provided with income at the band rather than via the school. So, that's a pretty big set of lies right there, and certainly off-putting. Like if you were someone who came to tell your recollections to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and you had a great time at Indian residential school, this would immediately put you off, I think. And there's a thing called social pressure and group pressure. And people would say to themselves, well, if this is the tone set in the room, I don't want to challenge this narrative and be the only one in the room going, hey, my time at residential school was great. Because I'm going to look bad. I'm going to look stupid. I'm going to look like an outlier. So now Robert Carney was a historian and a former professor at the University of Alberta. He was the father of Mark Carney, who's more famous as the UN climate czar, also the former Bank of Canada governor, former Bank of England governor. Anyway, here's what Mark Carney wrote, and he was critiquing the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report of 1966. And he found that they also left out very important information, even back then, in the same way that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission left out this time around. And he said it would have been fair to acknowledge in the Royal Commission report that many traditional Indian residential school boarding schools, in some cases well into the 20th century, took in sick, dying, abandoned, orphaned, physically and mentally handicapped children from newborns to late adolescents, as well as adults who asked for refuge and other forms of assistance. So that's a short summary of the social net that they offered to people in the region. So, it's a shame that the work of these devoted priests and nuns and other clergy and all the other staff are being dismissed as, criminal or nefarious or genocidal when they were caring for the least of society, the people who are most vulnerable. So, because of that also, unidentified graves might be found because some of these people were transients. Some of the people were travelers. In those days, people didn't walk around with ID. Nobody really had ID in their pocket. They didn't need it. So if that person came to get help, maybe they were a traveler and they were feeling sick and they're out in the middle of nowhere and there's a residential school. If they died, well, they would definitely be in an unmarked grave, and there might not be documentation to support it. But so their unidentified graves may be found, but of people who are unrelated to the schools. And, I would say that other than the Pope, Mark Carney is probably the most influential Catholic in the world, and yet he's silent. He hasn't said a word about the Catholic churches being burnt down and vandalized. And he hasn't said a word to prop up his father's legacy, because his father's historical legacy is very detailed and important. And it captures the history in that time period. So people often talk about how children disappeared at schools. And this is where we have, really a lack of historical context. This is the problem, a lack of historical context. People have completely forgotten the plague of tuberculosis that was ruinous to the lives of every family in Canada, in the United States, around the world. It was called the captain of all these men of death because it was such a deadly disease. So I really recommend that people watch this PBS documentary to understand how incredibly impactful it was on society at large. It is based in the United States, this documentary, but it parallels what was happening in Canada. So it's the forgotten plague. No one even talks about it today. And until the 1950s, TB was the greatest killer of all Canadians. And you can see here in this excerpt from a paper by Moffat et al. And they're talking about how people were sent off to TB sanatoriums to get well. It wasn't like just going to the doctor like today or going into hospital for a week or two. People were there for weeks and sometimes for years. So listen to this. One testimonial, an Aboriginal testimonial in Moffat reads, "My brother went to the sanatorium and he stayed there for 7 years. And he was allergic to the medication. It took 7 years for TB to go dormant. I never knew my brother. My older sister has no memory of him. My siblings never met their brother until he was 13. He was a total stranger. That's the emotional part, that we had a brother we never knew. So you can imagine your brother or sister goes off to Indian residential school. While there, TB manifests itself. Many times the family already was infected with TB, but in children, it maybe didn't show up until they were in another setting where, maybe the change, the stress, whatever, it manifested itself. Then they're sent on to a sanatorium or a hospital to be healed. Well, and then they don't come back for a few months or a few years. So to that community, they would have disappeared. And when a 13-year-old comes home after you've sent a 7-year-old away, and they don't speak their language anymore, and they look completely different, and you wonder, where did that other kid go? Well, to the community, they disappeared. So I think that's where a lot of this sense of people vanishing, going missing, really comes from. And TB, as I said, was the captain of all these men of death. So it commonly infects the lungs, and a typical symptom of someone who had advanced TB was that they would have a lung hemorrhage, and it's horrible, but there would be huge gushes of blood spurting across the room. And we often hear in some of the testimonies or statements from former school survivors, as they call themselves, that, that there was blood all over the room, or there were all these bloody blankets, and that's how we knew there was a murder going on. Well, it was most likely this type of thing, cleaning up after such a hemorrhage from a TB sufferer. And that person likely would have been sent on to more care at a sanatorium, or sadly, sometimes they did pass away. And it often was a surprise when people had this condition, because TB can be quite sneaky. You don't really notice that you have it. And of course, in the earliest days, they had very little ability to diagnose it. But it was found to be very contagious. And so there was kind of a big movement in the public sector to have public sanitation and say not spitting in the carriages. Not only was it offensive, but it is a source of serious disease. And again, many former residential school students will say, oh, it was awful. We had to scrub the halls, and we had to throw away our clothes when we got there, or our clothes were taken away. We were given institutional clothes. Well, a lot of this was all about creating a sanitary environment to reduce the risk of TB transmission. So this is from one of my books. You can also download this as a PDF from my website, or you can buy it on Kindle. But it talks about ambiguous losses. And I think that this is really behind the sort of memory, shall we say, the collective memory of many of the people who are certain that people went missing. And here's an example. This is from Eric Bay's book, Indian Residential Schools, Another Picture. He explains that at the Hudson Bay Trading Post at Albany, a father showed up saying there was no food in the family tent and his wife was ill. The father then died. The Hudson Bay sent out men with food, only to find the family in a tent, the mother deceased with 5 children around her. A 2-month-old baby was given up to a relative. The 16-year-old joined other relatives on a hunt, and the remaining 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, came to the residential school. And during a flu epidemic, years later, the youngest of the 3 died at the school. So you can see how a whole community would feel that, wow, those kids went to residential school and vanished. They're missing. They never came back. Well, they could never come back to the community if there was no parents to care for them. So they probably stayed at the school sometimes their entire life. Sometimes they graduated and moved on to other places. They had no family to draw them back. And sometimes they stayed at the school and became staff. But to the community, the feeling would be that, for instance, that one day, 5 people vanished from that community. 5 out of 7 of the family members were gone for all intents and purposes. The baby probably didn't know anything when it grew up about its mother and father. And the boy, who knows what he would remember. So, did children die at Indian residential schools? Yes, some did. Most died of TB, some died of injury. So we can see here these numbers are from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In the named register, 423 children died at school. So if you think of 150,000 students who attended over the course of 113 years, that is actually a pretty good record that not many children died. Of course, every death is tragic, but that's not a substantial number of children who died at school. I think that you could look at schools today and find that, sadly, there are many instances of children who have died at school. Accidents, sports accidents, illness. And you can see even the other numbers there are not very significant based on 150,000 students. So I started off talking about UNDRIP. What's this got to do with these graves? Well, let's look. So before the Kamloops Declaration of finding human remains, bodies of children young as 3, 6 provinces had objected to UNDRIP, and the Kamloops find ended that. UNDRIP passed into law on June 21st, 2021, which is about a month after the Kamloops find, because people were in such shock, nobody wanted to push back anymore. It seemed improper. And of course, what we don't think about is the geopolitics of this. China accused Canada of genocide at the UN, citing the Kamloops find. That was the day after UNDRIP passed. And here's the Washington Post reporting on this. China calls for Canada human rights inquiry, preempting demands for an investigation into abuse of Uyghurs, because Canada had been primed to accuse China of genocide over its abuse of the Uyghur people. Here's how the Washington Post reports on the Canadian story, referencing the recent discovery of the remains of 215 children at the Kamloops school. China and its allies sought a thorough and impartial investigation, not just of the discovery, but of broader Canadian crimes against Indigenous people. And China's allies were autocratic countries which are accused of human rights abuses. It's unbelievable. You can make this into a movie. Belarus, North Korea, and Syria all chimed in with China. And now we have dueling demands on genocide, China and the Uyghurs versus Canada and the Indians. And you can see here the dueling demands represented a deep geopolitical and ideological divide at the UN human rights body. Iran, Russia, Venezuela also backed China's demands for an investigation into Canada. And the remains found in Canada included those of Indigenous children as young as 3, shocking many Canadians. But no remains have been found. And it does say here that in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada concluded that the forced separation and cruel treatment of Indigenous children at the schools between 1883 to 1996 constituted cultural genocide. Well, that's not actual genocide, far from it. And bizarrely, ironically, while Canada was providing education, food, clothing, skills to Indigenous children, China was starving 40 million people of its own people in a state-sponsored genocide, a real one. So that's Tombstone. It's a very painful book to read, but valuable to know about. The Great Chinese Famine, 1958 to 1962. So as I mentioned before, TB was the greatest killer of all Canadians until the 1950s. And you can see here on the chart that comes from the Truth and Reconciliation Report that TB, especially in the early days, was a significant killer of children at schools. And in fact, oddly enough, this is not given much prominence when the entire family of Stephen Cacfe's mother was wiped out by tuberculosis. So, he's married to Marie Wilson, who was one of the TRC commissioners. His mother also was in TB treatment off and on for the first six of the first 12 years of his life. So, that's lived experience that seems somehow to have not shown up in documentation. But here we have this cairn at Kamloops. It seems like it was put up a long time ago, and it seems like the genocide theme had been in the works for some time. Now, this is former professor Frances Widdowson, and she's also an author. She was a professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary and was fired for her stance on various issues, but primarily on Indian residential schools and Indian affairs. And she's written a number of books on the Indigenous industry in Canada and how so many different sectors of society are really literally cashing in on the Indian industry. She's also a co-author, contributor of Grave Error, which is a great book. Now, what we know so far is that ground-penetrating radar was used to discover anomalies in Kamloops, but ground-penetrating radar cannot see bodies, remains, or coffins. This is what it looks like to see something in ground-penetrating radar. And it also depends very much on the soil type, moisture. There are many, many factors. But, all you can see are disturbances or anomalies. And ironically and oddly, the RCMP handed the investigation over to the Kamloops Band. So the RCMP started investigating this mass crime scene. Imagine 215 children murdered, allegedly, by priests and nuns and buried in the middle of the night, making small children bury their own classmates. That was the story. So they started investigating, and Murray Sinclair, one of the commissioners, I believe it was when he told the Senate that the RCMP were being far too aggressive. And so somehow they were pulled off the investigation. Well, they happen to have an Indigenous detachment supervisor at the time. So it's not like they had some person on staff who was culturally insensitive to the whole issue. But it's unheard of that victims would retain site security of an alleged crime scene and take over the investigation. That's just unheard of. So that site has not been secured by any neutral party now for 3 years. And also here we have Sarah Beaulieu, who was the GPR operator. And again, it says this researcher confirmed presumed unmarked graves, but all she did was GPR work. And as you saw before, you can't confirm anything from this. And in fact, no one checked the previous land use records, because if they would have seen that it wasn't maybe sacred ground, it's old septic trenches. So these old septic trenches pretty much align with where the claimed bodies were found. Now, genocide has all kinds of implications internationally, nationally, and these are like legal action, reparations, money, land back. And you can see that curiously, a lot of the environmental groups are suddenly on the Indigenous land back bandwagon as well. Like, why? What's all that about? And this suggests that land back is an Indigenous-led movement with a rich and complex meaning. Land back is people returning back and finding their place in those systems of life. But in fact, what's happening is people are saying, oh, this land is full of probable unmarked graves, and it's sacred to us, so no one can touch it now. So you can imagine how easy it would be to proliferate that all across Canada, and suddenly that's how you get your land back. Now, most people are not aware that there are 634 First Nations communities in Canada. They represent more than 50 nations and 50 Indigenous languages. But that really makes up 1.8 million Indigenous people in Canada. And the First Nations bands, when you say a nation, it sounds big, but the band numbers are actually quite small. So one of the biggest ones is the Six Nations of the Grand River at 12,757 people. And the Kamloops band is number 41 on that list, which was 1,785 people, of which 990 are non-Aboriginal and 795 are Aboriginal. So, you know, that's a complicating thing to have all these different First Nations traditions, slightly different cultures, slightly different language. You know, how do we go forward trying to deal with the Canadian mosaic? This would appear to be one of the weakest links in Canada's unity, especially because Canada's treasured chest of critical minerals are usually located on or near land that is claimed by these many First Nations. Now, oddly, there's a very big push from the United Nations that somehow Indigenous cultures constitute 20% of the Earth's land mass, but that land harbors 80% of the remaining diversity. So the Indigenous groups of the world by the UN are given some kind of priority over any other group. And you can see there's a movement for the land needs guardians. There's a land guardian movement in Canada. And this sort of presupposes that there's some inherent intuitive ability to care for the land of Canada much better than any non-Indigenous person could. That somehow this is, you know, transmitted like genetically or spiritually. And in fact, of course, here's the National Catholic Register asking the question, like, what is going on at the World Economic Forum? What spirit rules in Davos? And you can see a video of this shamanic priest, Chiefess Putani, making some kind of supplication or prayer at the Davos event, and then going and blowing forceful blast of air on the heads of all these important people like Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF and the head of MasterCard Worldwide, the World Bank. I mean, you know, if you had had a Catholic priest there who suddenly offered the sacraments to everyone, I think they would have kicked him out. But this was quite acceptable, even magical. So what is going to be happening now under UNDRIP is that the consultant class are going to, and the climateers want to trade nature-based carbon offsets. So the First Nations would be the keepers of the land, and they'd be paid climate money. And Deloitte has a number of reports on this. You have to realize what they're planning to do is to commodifies nature. And so, you know, if I'm a large emitter and I want to continue emitting, then I can just buy some carbon credits. For instance, right now, Nature Conservancy has a project in BC called Dark Woods. And what they do is they take a plot of land, they allegedly guarantee its sustenance as a natural feature for the next 100 years. And then they buy and sell carbon credits related to that reserve. Now, you know, no one asks the question, what happens if it goes up in smoke? I mean, we hope it wouldn't, right? But it's a forest, and over a 100-year period, it should go up in smoke because that's how the forest renews itself. But who will be on the hook for those carbon credit liabilities? Somebody paid money for a good carbon offset, and now it's gone up in smoke and created more CO2. So, we should not fall into this trap, because it may turn out that Canadians will end up having to pay those liabilities, and all these guys will get off scot-free and get money from these strange sources. But really, carbon offsets are Enron all over again. And if you're a person who's never heard of Enron, I advise you to look it up. It was a huge energy company, considered to be one of the best companies in the United States. I think was top 6 or something like that. They really hired a lot of excellent people, but the people at the top were corrupt, and Enron collapsed in ashes in about 1999, I think it was. And one of the best things I've ever read about carbon offsets is this article in Harper's from 2010, February 2010, written by Mark Shapiro. And he said that carbon market is based on the lack of delivery of an invisible substance to no one. And Anas El-Haji here, who's an international energy expert, pointed out that carbon offset developer reports ex-CEO to feds over bad credit. Well, carbon accounting is the mother of all Enrons. And he's saying, for the 100th time, I repeat. Now, after the find in Kamloops, this lady was appointed as the special interlocutor of missing children and unmarked graves. Her name is Kimberly Murray. She's a lawyer. And she's not a historian. So she's been cranking out these reports. This is the first report that came out, and then this is an interim report that was not requested. She was supposed to have issued a final report by now. It will apparently be out in September, but this was issued in the interim. So she's been doing a similar thing to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, meeting in these sharing circles and hearing from people, trying to track down the missing persons. But most of these reports are filled with outrageous claims, like things like that nuns and priests were murdering children and burying them in the middle of the night. Their children were forced to dig graves, that babies were incinerated at these schools, things that there's no historical evidence for it, but these res legends and myths have become fact in her documents. And she's also been filing unvetted human rights accusations to the UN Special Rapporteur, which, as I pointed out before, with China accusing us of genocide, this has international geopolitical consequences. That's not her job to do that. She was only supposed to report to the Justice Minister in Canada. None of these reports have been vetted by any parliamentarians. She and her office are just cranking them out and sending them off. And of course, when the special rapporteur came here, of course, he found that we had this appalling legacy of residential schools because he's getting reports like this. And she filed another report, unvetted human rights accusations to the UN Special Rapporteur. She filed this one with the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People. So all these reports will be used against Canada by international groups like China and its allies who have accused us of genocide. And that has repercussions for us as a country. I mean, think when South Africa was accused of apartheid. There were many trade embargoes against South Africa. There were some banking issues against South Africa. So, it can be extremely difficult for us as a country. And these are the kind of accusations that are very hard to counter once they're out there in the public, because it is an official report, right? And it looks very official. So it's hard to question. So Canada now is deemed guilty without trial or evidence. And even 22 lawyers, many of them from Alberta, demanded that the International Criminal Court investigate Canada for genocide and crimes against humanity. It's unbelievable. Like, who would ask the International Criminal Court to investigate their own country for such crimes, heinous crimes, for which there's no actual evidence. It's all based on statements, recollections of people who are remembering things that happened to them when they were 5, when they were 6, when they were 8. So the main point is this. This special interlocutor, Kimberly Murray, said that history of residential school cemeteries is evidence of genocide. Cemeteries are evidence that we're all mortal. That's it. So you have to ask these questions, and ask these questions of anyone who talks about this topic. Ask them of your parliamentarians. Who were the children? Who are their families? How did they die? When did the parents or guardians report them missing? And why are the RCMP not investigating? Now, just think about this. Who were the children? You say, well, we don't know. They're missing. Okay, well, how do you find a missing person? You find a missing person by their name. Like if you go to the police and say, someone's missing in my family, they'll say, okay, what's their name? What's your family name? You know, so you say, okay, my brother Jack went to Red Deer and he didn't come back, and it's, 5 days later, we can't get his cell phone. Okay, what's your family name? Smith. Okay, Jack Smith is missing in Red Deer. They put out an announcement and they say this is his family name. They may put other family contact information there. And that's how we find Jack. So if we don't have a list of names of people who are alleged to be missing, then who's missing? And people make various claims about how people died. Okay, what is the name of the person who died and how did they die? Oh, well, we don't know because they're missing. You see, the logic doesn't work. And the thing that most Canadians and even people outside of Canada are completely unaware of is how much money has been spent on various claims, class actions, land claims, compensation for residential school damage. This is a very good report by Dr. Tom Flanagan. It's issued by the Fraser Institute. So we're basically paying de facto reparations. None of these are being contested in court because when Jody Wilson-Raybould left office, she instructed departmental lawyers to seek negotiated settlements instead of litigating vigorously. And these instructions were formalized in her litigation guidelines, which were issued in 2019 and are still in effect. So we now have, this says for a total of almost $60 billion, all kinds of contingent liabilities related to residential schools and land claims. It's now up to more like 76 billion. It's about 3% of our GDP now. And no parliamentarians are looking over these deals. And Minister Gary Anandasangari, I call him Gary Giveaway, he's out there right now giving, money away, land away. He recently made an apology to Dakota and Lakota people who came here as refugees from the United States. And he said, we are sorry. And they basically said, and you're going to be even more sorry. And about 2 weeks later, they said, you know what? The Dakota people said, downtown Winnipeg belongs to us. That was our traditional territory. So, what have we gotten ourselves into? It's ridiculous. And the upshot is that land title and resource development is turning upside down. So it's just as the 6 provincial leaders feared, because now actually the Canadian government is trying to align all Canadian laws with UNDRIP. And here's an example, though, of like foreign interference, which is in the background on all these issues. This is an initiative for Project Finance for Permanence initiatives. This is turning parts of Canada into permanent conservation areas under Indigenous supervision. And you will notice that this is blocking access to major seaports and sea routes, and also access to major mineral opportunities. So this has been funded by the Pew Charities out of the United States. And it says Pew has supported Indigenous-led conservation, including since the late 1990s in the Northwest Territories. Along with other partners, Pew provided direct financial assistance to First Nations to engage in land use planning, establish Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and expand the Indigenous Guardians program, complemented with in-kind communications, policy analysis, networking, and partnership building support. So, this is a foreign charity that is changing Canadian public policy without Canadians being involved, or certainly not mainstream Canadians. And here's a land back deal in British Columbia, which is a national security risk. So on Haida Gwaii, a colonial government is no longer lord of the land. BC sort of handed back the Haida Gwaii Islands to the Haida Nation. This is probably in contravention of the Confederation and the Constitution. But this area is a very significant security risk to Canada. The US military used to have a base there. They had this radar called the Elephant Radar. They don't use it anymore, but this was only one of 3 in the world, so you can assume that it was pretty significant to be there. And in World War II, Colonel Mitchell of the US said, "He who rules Alaska rules the world." Well, this area is basically, shall we say, in the armpit of Alaska. So we weren't involved as a nation in this giveaway deal by the BC government. And, all we have to do is wait for Norway to recognize Haida Nation as an independent country, and you'll see where the balkanization of Canada goes. And even the Catholic Kamloops Sacred Covenant is rewriting history, sadly. We have myself and a couple of other researchers, and Nina Green is one of them, have the original documents in Chinook Wawa, which was the language that Father Lejeune developed and for writing down the formerly oral languages of the people of the region. Now, in this document, they claim that when Father Lejeune and others went to the Vatican to see the Pope, that they went there to petition his support for Indigenous jurisdiction and title over Indigenous lands. That's simply not true. It's just not true at all. They just went there for a similar kind of papal visit or a Vatican visit that any devout Catholic would do today. They were blessed in a large group ceremony by the Pope of the time. And that's it. They didn't petition for anything while they were there. And obviously, our international reputation has been ruined. There may be more risks ahead. So the international commissions of inquiry, commissions on human rights, fact-finding missions, and other investigations. Do we really want the UN stomping around in our backyard, especially after they've been sent all of these unvetted, crazy reports that are not backed up by any evidence? So here's a picture of Father Noonan with the students of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. They look like they're having a pretty good time. And the Kamloops Indian Residential School had a big reunion, some genocide. So just to recap, Indian Residential School facts. Education was offered in the treaties, and chiefs and councils requested education, particularly skills training like literacy, agriculture, industry, medical, and clerical. Parents had to register their children to attend. Schooling was not mandatory until 1920, which was in keeping with provincial truancy laws. Detailed death certificates were issued if TB, disease, or injury caused a death. And these certificates, by and large, show that the child's body was sent home for burial on the reserve. Some children were orphans with no one else to help them and nowhere else to go. And residential schools served as the regional social services medical hub in the early days. And in 1908, 1 Canadian died every hour of the day, 2 Canadians died every hour of the night from TB. So the Euro-Canadian priests and nuns saved their lives and taught thousands of Indigenous children to read and write. As noted in Xinguac's vision, and Assiniboine chief recalled, our children and grandchildren will be taught the magic art of writing. Just think for a moment what that means. Without the aid of a spoken word, our children will be able to transmit their thoughts on a piece of paper, and that talking paper may be carried to distant parts of the country and convey your thoughts to your friends. Why, even the medicine men of our tribe cannot perform such miracles. And in return for all that teaching, Canada is being balkanized by fake news, foreign interference, and opportunists. So I hope that that's given you some insights on the importance of the claims about these unmarked graves and how it's connected to UNDRIP. This is almost never discussed in the press in Canada. So if you'd like to support my work, you can. These are my reports, which are in PDF form on my website free of charge, or you can buy them in a Kindle form and support me in that way. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Michelle. The chat here throughout it was going, this is an excellent presentation. I mean, you have done your research, you have provided evidence. Canadians, you know, we've been so whipped into being silent, into, the criticisms that come if you speak the truth, and you have to do it boldly, and that's what you've done. And I wrote a report last year. I wouldn't mind bringing it up in just a minute so that people can go and find even more information on it. I'm going to be putting this video on that webpage. If people who are viewing, we will have it in the description of the Rumble video when we post it as well, along with the links to Michelle's website. And I think this is critical, a very critical, vital presentation that needs to be shared with elected officials at all levels of government. And as you had mentioned going through there are some people who have not bothered to research. They're signing on the dotted lines, or they're going along with it because they've been lobbied, or they're lazy and they haven't, bothered to think that maybe there's another side to this story. The political correctness can run deep, and it's been so damaging to our nation. And this is a very big part of the strategy by the globalists to use the natives, as I mentioned at the onset of this, as pawns in order to steal our land, to steal our minerals and resources. And you mentioned UNDRIP in British Columbia. It's only been signed on in BC as far as provinces are concerned, and I believe the federal level. Yeah, and DRIPA, right. And it's unconstitutional. Would you agree that that needs to be revoked and overturned?
I would, because there are many, it's far too nebulous, first of all. And secondly, we cannot rewrite the entire laws of Canada to align with something that came from the UN and not from the people of Canada. And you can see there are many absurd things that are happening in BC, where now especially in BC, because there are lots of overlapping land claims, because there were no or virtually no treaties signed in BC at the beginning, as there were on the prairies. So you have bands saying, okay, well, we claim this area for us, and we're going to make a deal with the BC government and with this firm because we're going to open a mine or something. And the band right next door will say, well, actually, we claim the same land that you're on, and we don't want to do that because we think it's spiritual and sacred to us. So, and even you see now there's a group in BC that just, they're burning up a signed agreement that they had with an LNG pipeline company and saying, well, we changed our minds. So, you can't do business that way. So it's
No.
insane.
And by doing all of this, they're just the government, the globalists, as they know, are just emboldening the natives. They're emboldening them. They're solidifying their victimization, and it's infuriating. I mean, Canadians want to stop the gravy train. We're tired of. There's 127 billion on the table right now in Ontario. That was from a few months ago, so I've got to double check if they've paid it out or not. As far as another scenario of what the natives have claimed the government owes them. And it's like, we weren't part of that. You've proven that, there was nothing hugely nefarious that has gone on in Canada regarding the natives. And when I say, I don't deny that, there were, like you said, some children that died and some that were hurt. But if we take a look at, for instance, other wars that have been throughout history, and especially, for instance, the Muslims that have come in and they violently came in and persecuted Christians, murdered them, raped them, stole their land, and it's never been returned. The UN has nothing to say about it. In all of those countries that were majority Christian, they are continuing to behead Christians and persecute them, burn them alive, rape them, etc. And the UN is silent. And so people have to really start to think critically again and go beyond. So if they're not concerned at all about the Christians that are being persecuted in all of these countries, in China and other nations, then why are they so focused on the natives? And it is because these are majority Western nations built on democracies, and they want to destroy those in order to have this global government.
Right. Well, and another thing, I don't know if I mentioned it in my talk, but we have to remember that in the United States, there actually were Indian wars going on, right, from 1644 to 1924. But that was not happening in Canada. We were economic trade partners for 300 years or more with Native people in Canada, and so that's why we had the Lakota and Dakota people come over the border Canada for refuge from the U.S. cavalry, because they knew that it was not our way in Canada to run around and gun down Indians because we wanted to claim people's land. We came and made a deal. And it's true that some aspects of the treaties were not fulfilled in certain ways, but these have been negotiated, and overall, most aspects were taken care of, because if the Americans had stayed in Canada, like the American whiskey traders who came up just before the Mounties came west, they were just slaughtering the Blackfoot people. They just get them drunk as much as they could with horrible poisonous mixture of turpentine, whiskey, old tea, and then they would steal their furs and steal their women, steal their horses, and shoot them. So, it was the Mounties that stopped that devastation. Otherwise, they would have all been wiped out. And had the cavalry come over the border here, there wouldn't have been anybody to talk about.
No, and it says in the Bible that we shouldn't, when we go into a land, you shouldn't sign any treaties. And this is a good reason, why these treaties need to be revoked. It's a matter of, I don't think even the Native community look at the fact, as you said, that we came in for hundreds of years trading, signing treaties in fairness. And I know that John A. Macdonald, they've really demonized him. And through research, I found that he was one of the ones that was one of the greatest advocates in protecting Indigenous people. And so there's so many lies that have been spun. And yet the truth is right there, and trying to make sure they don't erase history so that they can, because in the end, once the government has come in and handed this so-called land back as far as land rights are concerned, which is completely bogus, it doesn't belong to the Indigenous. My property, belongs to me. I worked hard for it. And once this is completed, do you think that the natives are really going to have any property rights at the end of all of this? Has the Liberal government ever treated the natives nicely or fairly? No. So as I said, we've got a common enemy, and, we need to unite and together come against the government. And we need to, once again, support our Constitution and our Constitution, and make sure that we're honoring that The Haida Gwaii situation, I mean, that's very, very concerning. And I know that, as you said, the DRIPA, is it at the federal level that UNDRIP has been already passed, or is that still being spoken about?
No, UNDRIP has been passed at the federal level, but only BC has adopted it provincially, and it's under DRIPA is the short form
of it. And again, that I believe was an unlawful contract that they've negotiated with an unelected body who's interfering consistently with our democracies, our constitution, and our rule of law. Would you agree?
How do you mean?
Well, that the United Nations, its UNDRIP is United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. The United Nations is pushing this contract, and the government has aligned with it. But those are unelected officials. Like, they have never asked Canadians if this is something that they want. And so how can Trudeau get away with doing this?
UNDRIP was put forward in Parliament. It is, so the declaration was written by the UN and offered kind of to the world, to countries that have Indigenous people. And then those countries chose to accept or reject it. And actually in Australia and New Zealand, they've rejected it. And they had very bloody confrontations there between incoming European pioneers and the native people, which we did not have here. So we ended up accepting it. But as you can see, we didn't accept it in its proper form, because 6 provinces were pushing back and saying, wait a minute, well, what does consent mean? Is it retroactive? Like, if we say yes to this legislation, does it mean that we have a mine or a oil sands development or a drilling project, and all of a sudden the people can come and say, well, we didn't consent to that in 1959, so you have to shut it down or sell it to us or give it to us, or, these are the details. They're very, very important. Does it mean that any Indigenous person in Canada or any Indigenous group in Canada can have a say on any resource development, even if it's in a different province or thousands of miles away? These things are not clear at all. And that's why they didn't want it to pass. But it's been passed now, and now we're, tromping through the mud of it because these things are not clear.
No, and I think it needs to be revoked, because 100% it is a constitutional challenge that needs to be heard. But as long as Trudeau is in government, and who knows about Pierre Poilievre when he gets in, the courts are corrupted, and for whatever reason, they think that a global government is a good idea, but it's in violation. And I don't know if you're very familiar with the King Charles signed it, the coronation oath, and. No. Okay, so the Queen had signed on it generationally. As far back, the monarch would sign the coronation oath, and it committed that the monarch and all nations tied to that would be governed by Protestant biblical principles. And I was just listening to Alex Newman talking about the United States as well, and his comment was fantastic. I posted it on my Twitter page, and it's dead right on, is that this nation was founded on Judeo-Christian biblical principles. And it's that the monarch that we're still a part of, no matter how anybody feels about King Charles. He tried to involve all religions, but the Church of England came against him and said, no, it remains traditionally as the Protestant religion based on biblical principles. And so anything that Trudeau has passed since he's come into office actually just needs to be overturned, but this needs to be challenged and done in the courts. And I believe that UNDRIP would fall under that. And that what's happening in British Columbia, because I got caught up in this last year when a chief came after me in BC. I was doing speaking engagements, and he was attacking me, saying I couldn't come on the land. That's what caused me to do the report, is I found out they're signing all kinds of secret land treaties throughout British Columbia, and the citizens are completely unaware of it. And I want our viewers to understand, if you live in British Columbia, we've got a very important election coming up in October. And John Rustad has agreed to deal with this issue. and we'll have a new attorney general. We'll hopefully have, a court system that would be functioning. So it's very, very important that people get involved in this election. Go door knocking know who you're voting for and where they stand on this particular issue, because this is destroying Canada. And if we don't overturn this in BC, it's going to be a model for the other provinces. Would you agree with that?
Probably. I'm not entirely up on the situation in BC, but in general, I agree with what you said. But I do want to make one other point, and that is the T-shirt I'm wearing. I think one of the really important things we have to do is to recognize that every living child matters most of all. Yes. And that's a theme that I hope that people will begin promoting, because there's not much that we can do for children who've passed on other than pray for them and remember them. And as difficult as it is, they're gone. But all of our children are suffering now from this division in society. We have non-Indigenous children feeling like their ancestors and their parents and grandparents were horrible murderers who allowed this to happen, who were blind to what was going on, who don't care, who are heartless. Some schools are doing Orange Shirt Day every Friday. They're like wearing a hair shirt. It's like, that's crazy. And the Indigenous children, I mean, what are they thinking if their band and their families are all engaged in doing grave digging? Like, hey, mom, dad, I'm here. I'm alive. I need help. A lot of these kids are being exposed to drugs and prostitution and trafficking and gangs. And, these are the living kids that we can help. Yeah. And that's what we should put our attention on. Yeah, I know. Collectively as Canadians.
Yeah, it is so cruel what the Canadian government is doing. I've had parents of Caucasian kids coming home and saying they were told to stand up in class and apologize for their white privilege. It was a boy. And then you've got another mom in Squamish who contacted me and said her kids are in elementary school and they never looked at the color of the skin of their classmates and their friends. They all live in the same communities with the same privileges. And it is just so disgusting that the government would pit our children and use them for their own profit and their own advancement of this, I want to call it a Marxist globalist agenda. My mom grew up in the Netherlands and she experienced abuse. I've told our viewers that before. And, she went through the Second World War and there's no reparations for her. Life is rough. And if our kids don't understand it equally, that we're all treated equally in Canada and we try to help each other, what would the natives of today whose children are being taken off the reserves, what are they going to be demanding in a few hundred years? Because I have friends who are partly native who are working with child services in Alberta, and they've had little girls taken off the reserves who have been raped, who have been sexually abused or abused in other ways, fetal alcohol syndrome. There's a lot of damage that remains on the reserves, and they've got to stop blaming anybody for that. And we've got to stop funding the destruction of these people. They need to earn a living. They need to have that pride in earning something and learning to work for it and have proper education. We need to break this cycle somehow. And I think by telling the actual truth, rather than perpetuating these systemic lies of the government, is the only way that we're going to get through this.
Right. I agree.
Yeah. All right, Michelle, thank you so much for coming on. Again, I'm going to encourage people, follow Michelle, join her. We're going to have the links that are going to be provided in the description. And please share this with your elected officials. I always say that knowledge is power. And when you have it, you got to use it and you got to put it to work. And so do that by sharing it. Super.
Thank you so much. Thank you on the show and good work. Keep it up.
Yeah, thank you. And your puppy behaved tonight. You made it all the way through this fabulous presentation. It was all good. Thank you. Just God bless you in the work that you continue to do.
And you too.